the moment Karoline Leavitt exclaimed, "I can't believe you're asking such a question," served as a flashpoint in the debate, reflecting not just emotional intensity, but the wider ideological tension gripping today's political discourse. This reaction wasn't simply about a disagreement. It was a charged expression of disbelief, frustration, and a deep-rooted sense of being misunderstood or unfairly characterized. To understand the weight of her statement, it's important to explore both the context in which it was made and what it reveals about the broader dynamics of political communication and perception. When someone publicly expresses incredulity in such a raw and unrehearsed way, especially in the high-stakes setting of a televised debate, it signifies more than a rhetorical defense. It becomes a cultural signal. The line drew attention not only because of its sharpness, but because it tapped into a growing sentiment among a large portion of the public who feel their views are frequently misrepresented or caricatured. Leavitt's remark resonated with those who believe that the questions posed to them, whether by the media or political opponents, are often framed in a way that presumes guilt, ignorance, or malevolence before any fair evaluation. Her tone, body language, and rapid escalation in voice energy during the exchange suggested that the question itself was not just unwelcome, but was perceived as offensive, possibly even manipulative. She viewed the framing of the issue as emblematic of a deeper bias, one that seeks to corner rather than clarify, to antagonize rather than understand. The response, then, wasn't just about that single moment. It was an eruption caused by the pressure built up from what she sees as persistent attempts to put her and others like her in a rhetorical trap. In debates like these, the actual content of the question often becomes secondary to the implications of how it's asked and what it's meant to provoke. Her exclamation also served a strategic purpose. It disrupted the rhythm of the conversation, shifted the momentum, and placed her opponent on the defensive. By flipping the narrative from answering to accusing, she repositioned herself from being scrutinized to doing the scrutinizing. It was a pivot, classic in confrontational debate styles, where the speaker refuses to accept the premise of the question and instead attacks the legitimacy of the question itself. In this case, it allowed her to seize the emotional high ground and rally her audience, both in the room and watching at home, around the idea that certain lines of questioning are out of bounds or reflect a deeper unfairness. Moreover, her statement wasn't necessarily about fact versus fiction, it was about respect versus condescension. In the current political atmosphere, feelings often weigh as heavily as facts. Voters want to feel heard, not talked down to. When a political figure expresses open disbelief at a question, it can humanize them to their base. It shows they have limits, that they too get fed up, that they are willing to draw a line. Leavitt's choice to vocalize her frustration wasn't a slip. It was a deliberate act of political theater aimed at connecting on an emotional frequency that transcends policy details. The debate format only heightened this dynamic. With time, limits, visible cameras, and real-time audience reactions, the pressure on candidates to deliver emotionally charged, memorable sound bites is enormous. In such settings, rational, step-by-step policy discussions often give way to dramatic moments designed to cut through the noise and stick in the viewer's mind. Her statement achieved that. It created a viral clip. It became a talking point. And whether one agreed with her or not, it inserted her point of view firmly into the media narrative surrounding the event. There is also a gendered dimension to consider. When a young female politician expresses outrage or challenges the legitimacy of a question in a high-profile setting, it often carries different connotations than when a male counterpart does the same. It can be seen either as courageous or overly emotional, depending on the viewer's bias. In this case, her directness likely struck many as a bold pushback against what she perceived as a patronizing tone. It reinforced her positioning as someone who refuses to be belittled or boxed into a stereotype. Her choice of words, especially the emphasis on disbelief, suggests not just a rebuttal, but a moral objection. She wasn't just denying the content of the question, she was implying that it was beneath the dignity of the conversation. That's a powerful move, one that tries to invalidate the very foundation of the exchange and establish new terms for the debate. In doing so, she claimed the role of a truth-teller under fire, someone who stands their ground in the face of provocation. And that, for many viewers, may be the most compelling argument of all. In the midst of a highly charged debate, the defense of involvement in previous impeachment proceedings was delivered with unwavering conviction. Rather than shying away from controversy, the speaker leaned into the opportunity to reassert the importance of accountability in public office, particularly when the integrity of democratic institutions is at stake. The tone was calm but resolute, reflecting a deep belief that actions taken in the past were not just justified, but necessary for the preservation of constitutional norms and the rule of law. Central to the argument was the notion that holding powerful leaders accountable is not a partisan act, but a patriotic duty. The speaker framed the prior impeachment efforts as a response to actions that went beyond mere political disagreements. The message was clear. When elected officials cross ethical or legal boundaries, the mechanisms of accountability must be activated, regardless of how politically difficult or divisive that may be. This point was emphasized as a cornerstone of democratic health, asserting that impunity at the top endangers the rights and freedoms of everyone else. By invoking the solemnity of the constitutional process, the speaker subtly reminded the audience that impeachment is not a tool of vengeance or theatrics, but a serious legal framework designed by the founders to protect the republic from potential abuses of power. Every step taken during those proceedings, according to this defense, was backed by evidence, law, and the imperative to uphold justice. The emphasis wasn't just on what happened, but why it had to happen, because to do nothing in the face of wrongdoing would have set a precedent that future leaders could exploit. This line of reasoning appealed to those who believe in the strength and resilience of democratic checks and balances. It portrayed the speaker not as a political actor seeking the spotlight, but as a public servant acting in line with institutional duty. There was a clear attempt to draw a distinction between popularity and principle, suggesting that while the impeachment proceedings may not have been universally welcomed, they were necessary from a standpoint of moral and constitutional clarity. Additionally, the speaker drew attention to the broader implications of failing to act when confronted with potential abuses of executive authority. It was argued that doing nothing would erode public trust in government, signaling that some individuals are above the law. This erosion, once set in motion, could have cascading effects, weakening voter confidence, emboldening future misconduct, and fraying the very fabric of the nation's legal and political norms. In this view, the prior efforts to initiate accountability were not just about one leader or one event. They were about maintaining the credibility of the entire democratic system. The defense was also tailored to resonate with a historically informed audience. It positioned the moment as one in a long continuum of critical junctures in American governance, where decisions had to be made not for short-term comfort, but for long-term preservation of democratic integrity. References to constitutional duty, checks and balances, and the responsibility of legislative oversight all framed the impeachment process as a legitimate and honorable use of power, not as overreach, but as stewardship. Emotionally, the speaker struck a careful balance. There was no gloating or triumphalism. Instead, there was a deep sense of the gravity of the events and the weight of the choices made. The tone conveyed that none of it was taken lightly. That sense of seriousness helped frame the role played as one of reluctant necessity, not political ambition. It was portrayed as a moment where silence would have been more comfortable, but action was the only morally acceptable path. Throughout the exchange, the message remained consistent. Democratic systems only function when those in power are willing to defend them, even when it's politically costly. The role in the past proceedings was described as part of a broader effort to ensure that future generations inherit a government that still answers to the people and still operates under the constraints of law. That vision of long-term accountability stood in sharp contrast to the more immediate, reactionary arguments offered by others. The defense thus operated on two levels, factual and philosophical. Factually, it underscored the steps taken, the evidence reviewed, and the procedural legitimacy of the process. Philosophically, it appealed to the audience's sense of justice and civic duty. It asked listeners to consider what kind of country they wanted to live in, one where leaders are above scrutiny, or one where power is always subject to the will and judgment of the people's representatives. Ultimately, the statement functioned as both a justification and a call to vigilance. It reminded viewers that democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires the courage to act when lines are crossed and the will to preserve foundational principles even. The debate surrounding border security has long been one of the most polarizing topics in national politics. In the recent exchange, the issue once again took center stage, revealing two fundamentally different visions for how the country should handle its borders, immigration system, and the values that guide both. While there was agreement that securing the border is essential, the pathways to achieving that goal were clearly at odds. One side emphasized control, enforcement, and restriction, while the other called for balance, humanity, and comprehensive reform. At the core of the discussion was a recurring theme: how to reconcile national security with human dignity. The speaker, advocating for a broader, more inclusive approach, did not deny the importance of a secure border. In fact, there was a clear acknowledgement that chaos at the borders, whether through drug trafficking, unauthorized crossings, or overstretched processing facilities, poses serious risks. However, the speaker insisted that any real solution must look beyond physical barriers or punitive measures. The answer, in their view, lies in modernizing the entire immigration system to reflect both security needs and the foundational values of the nation. This argument framed immigration not as a crisis to be feared, but as a challenge to be managed, with intelligence and compassion. The speaker pointed out that simplistic solutions like building taller fences or increasing Border Patrol agents without addressing root causes and systemic inefficiencies would only lead to temporary relief, not lasting change. Instead, they proposed a vision where investments in technology, international cooperation, and a clear, fair pathway for legal entry would stabilize the system while reducing the incentives for dangerous or unlawful crossings. In making the EU case, the speaker emphasized that border policy should not be reduced to slogans or photo ops. Real lives are at stake: children, families, and individuals fleeing violence, poverty, or political persecution. For them, crossing the border is not just a choice, it's often a desperate necessity. The speaker argued that treating these individuals as invaders rather than human beings erodes the nation's moral authority and undermines its global reputation. Instead of blanket demonization, the call was for structured, lawful processes that uphold both security and the country's long-standing identity as a place of refuge. Furthermore, the discussion moved into the territory of economics and workforce realities. It was argued that a well-regulated immigration system benefits the nation not just morally, but practically. Immigrants fill critical labor shortages, contribute to tax revenues, and start businesses at higher rates than native-born citizens. By creating legal avenues for work-based immigration, the speaker contended the country can reduce pressure at the border while simultaneously strengthening the economy. Another major point centered around the backlog and inefficiencies in the immigration courts and asylum processing systems. The speaker emphasized that the current delays, often lasting years, create a system where people live in limbo and enforcement becomes nearly impossible to manage fairly. By investing in more judges, caseworkers, and digital infrastructure, the system could move faster and more transparently, reducing bottlenecks and discouraging attempts to bypass it altogether. Underlying the speaker's position was a broader philosophy that national security and empathy are not mutually exclusive. According to this view, walls and deterrence may serve a function, but they must be part of a holistic policy that addresses why people come in the first place. Climate change, gang violence, and economic despair in neighboring countries were all mentioned as push factors that must be tackled through diplomacy and foreign aid, not just border crackdowns. Without addressing these root causes, the speaker argued, no border, no matter how well funded, will ever be fully secure. This vision of border security also called for rejecting rhetoric that paints immigrants as threats to the cultural or economic stability of the nation. Instead, the speaker promoted a narrative of shared prosperity where immigrants are partners in building a stronger future. The suggestion wasn't to open the borders indiscriminately, but to ensure that the laws reflect the reality of 21st century migration and the country's capacity to uphold justice and decency. What emerged was a picture of immigration policy that seeks to marry efficiency with ethics. It resisted the false choice between being secure and being humane. By focusing on comprehensive reform, streamlining legal pathways, strengthening asylum processes, increasing international partnerships, and investing in smart technology, the speaker laid out a blueprint for border policy that could be both effective and aligned with the nation's highest ideals. The topic of economic policy has always served as a defining line between political ideologies, and during the debate, it once again took center stage. Two opposing visions emerged, one advocating for expansive government involvement to support working families and address inequality, and the other pushing for a leaner, market-driven approach that prioritizes individual enterprise and reduced regulation. The clash of these perspectives wasn't just about numbers or budget lines. It was a debate about the fundamental role of government in shaping economic opportunity. One speaker outlined a vision focused on empowering the private sector and minimizing government intervention. The argument was built around the belief that economic prosperity comes not from government handouts or subsidies, but from freeing individuals and businesses to innovate and compete. This approach emphasized the value of entrepreneurship, job creation through private enterprise, and the need to reduce taxes and regulatory burdens that are seen as stifling economic growth. The speaker repeatedly returned to the idea that individuals, when unencumbered by excessive government oversight, are best equipped to make decisions for their families, communities, and businesses. A key point in this argument centered on the importance of tax reform. It was asserted that lowering taxes across the board, particularly for small businesses, would stimulate investment, drive hiring, and increase wages. The speaker contended that higher taxes, even when targeted at corporations or the wealthy, ultimately trickle down as costs to consumers or disincentives for growth. In this view, a more competitive tax code would encourage businesses to stay domestic, reinvest profits into their operations, and expand their workforce, ultimately creating a ripple effect that benefits the broader economy. Another focal point was the housing crisis and the cost of living. While acknowledging that many Americans are struggling with rising expenses, the speaker argued that the solution lies in reducing bureaucratic red tape that slows construction, inflates property values, and limits supply. Rather than relying on government-funded housing projects or subsidies, the emphasis was placed on removing zoning restrictions, simplifying permitting processes, and incentivizing private developers to build more affordable housing units. The belief is that increasing supply through market mechanisms will naturally drive prices down and improve access for middle and lower income families. Energy policy also entered the conversation, with the speaker pointing to rising energy costs as a drag on both households and businesses. The position was that the country must take advantage of its natural resources, including oil, gas, and nuclear energy, to reduce dependency on foreign energy and keep prices stable. Regulatory rollbacks and greater investment in domestic energy infrastructure were presented as solutions that would not only lower energy bills, but also support thousands of high-paying jobs. The argument suggested that overregulation and politically motivated restrictions on energy development were driving up costs and undermining economic competitiveness. Underlying all these points was a broader skepticism about the effectiveness of government-run programs. The speaker questioned the long-term sustainability and efficiency of initiatives that depend on taxpayer funding, warning that such programs often lead to bloated bureaucracies and unintended consequences. Examples were cited of mismanaged government projects and spending inefficiencies, all used to argue for a more disciplined fiscal approach that respects taxpayer dollars and avoids burdening future generations with debt. There was also a strong appeal to individual responsibility and self-reliance. Economic policy, according to this vision, should be about creating conditions where people have the tools and freedom to succeed on their own merit. Government, therefore, should act more as a referee than a player, setting fair rules, ensuring accountability, but not micromanaging every aspect of the economy. This approach places trust in the dynamism of the American worker and entrepreneur, positing that with fewer constraints, people will rise to challenges and build wealth, not just for themselves, but for their communities. The overall tone was optimistic about the power of markets to correct themselves and the resilience of individuals to overcome challenges when given the opportunity. Rather than proposing large-scale government spending or new entitlement programs, the speaker argued for policies that unlock potential, reward innovation, and encourage personal responsibility. The belief expressed was that government should empower rather than control, and that by doing so, the nation's economy would become more dynamic, competitive, and inclusive over time. As the debate drew to a close, the contrast between the two candidates had been firmly established, offering voters a clear sense of the choices before them. In their final statements, each aimed to crystallize their core message, reinforce their credibility, and make a lasting emotional appeal that would resonate beyond the stage. One candidate closed by doubling down on a vision of government that is active, engaged, and responsible for correcting systemic inequities. They emphasized the importance of compassion in policy, speaking directly to working families, marginalized communities, and those who feel left behind by a system they believe too often favors the wealthy and well-connected. The candidate expressed a belief that the government has not only the capacity, but the moral obligation to intervene when the market fails, or when vulnerable populations are at risk. Their closing words were not just about plans and programs, they were about principles, specifically the idea that justice, opportunity, and dignity must be accessible to all, not just the few. They appealed to voters' hopes for a more equitable society, reminding them of past achievements and calling for unity and forward momentum. It was a call to action rooted in empathy, painted with optimism, and delivered with a sense of moral urgency. Their final words urged Americans not to settle for the status quo, but to choose leadership that would fight for fairness, protect democracy, and invest in the future. They framed the election as a pivotal moment where the nation could either regress into division and inequality or rise to meet the challenges of the modern world with courage and conscience. The opposing candidate offered a very different closing message, grounded in a belief in individual liberty, economic freedom, and limited government. They made a passionate case for a return to common sense in policymaking, where personal responsibility, free enterprise, and accountability form the bedrock of national success. Their tone was assertive, often combative, aimed at challenging the credibility of bureaucratic institutions and political elites who, in their view, have grown too powerful and disconnected from everyday Americans. In their closing statement, they portrayed themselves as a fighter, not just against political opponents, but against systems and ideologies that they argued are suffocating innovation, crushing small businesses, and eroding cultural values. They emphasized a desire to put power back in the hands of the people, arguing that Americans are fully capable of managing their own lives without being told what to do by an overreaching government. Their appeal was aimed at those who feel their freedoms are under threat and who want a leader willing to take bold, unapologetic stands on behalf of the Constitution, economic growth, and national pride. In the end, both candidates sought to do more than win the argument. They sought to win trust. Their closing remarks weren't just policy summaries, they were declarations of identity and intention, crafted to leave a lasting impression of leadership, resolve, and vision for the